The gunshot echoed through Crystal Lake at 3 in the morning, shattering the silence that had wrapped around the mountain cabin like a protective shroud. Jake Matthews pressed his back against the rough pine wall, his weathered hands steady on the hunting rifle as footsteps crunched through fresh snow outside. Through the frosted window, he could see the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the clearing where Emma Carter lay unconscious in his bed, her fever finally breaking after 2 days of delirium. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "We know you're in there, Matthews," Detective Ray Morgan's voice carried across the frozen air, thick with authority and corruption. "Send out the woman, and we'll make this easy for everyone." Jake's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the bedroom where Emma stirred beneath layers of wool blankets, her dark hair spilled across the pillow like ink on snow. 3 days ago, he had found her collapsed in a snowdrift near Devil's Canyon, hypothermia claiming her consciousness while corporate security teams hunted her through the wilderness. Now they had tracked her to his sanctuary, bringing their city violence to his mountain refuge. "She's under my protection now," Jake called back, his voice carrying the weight of a promise that had formed in his heart without permission. The woman had stumbled into his isolated world carrying secrets that could destroy powerful men, and somehow in nursing her back to health, he had discovered something worth dying for. Morgan's laugh was harsh against the mountain silence. "Protection? From a disgraced ranger living like a hermit? Victor Blackstone owns half this county, Matthews. You're harboring a fugitive who stole corporate property. This ends one way." Through the window, Jake counted 4 shapes moving through the trees, their expensive winter gear marking them as outsiders in his domain. Corporate security, not local law enforcement. Men who followed orders without asking questions, who made problems disappear for the right price. Emma had whispered their names during her fever dreams, along with fragments of evidence that painted a picture of corruption stretching from hospital boardrooms to county courthouses. Emma's eyes opened in the dim light filtering from the main room, her gaze finding his immediately despite the lingering effects of exhaustion and cold. For a moment neither spoke. The connection that had sparked between them over 3 days of careful nursing and shared vulnerability needed no words. She was a stranger who had crashed into his solitary existence, yet something about her calm competence and quiet courage had awakened parts of himself he thought died with his brother. "How many?" she whispered, her voice steady despite the danger surrounding them. "4 that I can see, maybe more in the trees." Jake's fingers traced the stock of his rifle, feeling the familiar weight of a weapon that had fed him through 2 winters of exile. "They're not local, corporate muscle, like you said they'd send." Emma pushed herself upright despite his gesture for her to stay down, her movements careful but determined. 3 days ago, she had been a broken woman fleeing through mountain wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a laptop full of evidence. Now, even weakened by her ordeal, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had chosen principle over safety. "I won't let them take me back," she said quietly. "Not after what I've seen. Not after what they've done to cover up their crimes." Jake studied her face in the pale light, seeing the intelligence that had made her dangerous to men like Victor Blackstone, the moral courage that had driven her to expose medical fraud, even when it meant losing everything. She was educated, refined, everything his mountain existence wasn't, yet something fundamental connected them beneath the surface differences. "Then we don't let them," he said simply. 4 weeks earlier, Jake Matthews had been preparing for another winter alone on the mountain, splitting firewood and checking his trap lines with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to depend only on himself. The first snow had dusted the peaks around Crystal Lake, and he was calculating supplies for the long months ahead when his past caught up with him in the form of a certified letter delivered by Tommy Chen from the general store. The legal document bore the seal of Blackstone Development Corporation and the signature of Marcus Webb, senior partner at Webb, Morrison & Associates. The language was dense and intimidating, but the message was clear. His family's land, the 40 acres his grandfather had homesteaded and his father had worked until his death, was being seized for unpaid property taxes that had somehow tripled in the past year. Jake read the notice twice, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. For 18 months he had lived off the grid in the cabin his grandfather had built, hunting and fishing to survive, staying out of a system that had betrayed him once already. The land was all he had left after losing his job with the Forest Service, the last connection to a family that corporate greed had already destroyed. His brother Danny had died in a mine collapse that should never have happened, crushed beneath tons of rock while investigating safety violations for the county inspector's office. The official report blamed equipment failure, but Jake knew better. Danny had been asking too many questions about Blackstone's mining subsidiary, gathering evidence of safety violations that put profits ahead of workers' lives. 3 days before the accident, Danny had called Jake with excitement in his voice, talking about documents that would bring down the whole corrupt network. Those documents died with Danny in the Silver Creek mine, buried beneath corporate lawyers and insurance settlements that bought silence from grieving families. The mine inspector's office had offered Jake his brother's job, but he turned it down, knowing that working within a system that had killed Danny would be like putting his own neck in a noose. Instead, he had retreated to the mountain cabin, living simply and quietly while the investigation into his brother's death faded from public attention. He thought isolation would bring peace, but peace was a luxury men like Victor Blackstone didn't allow. Now they wanted his land too, completing their stranglehold on the entire Crystal Lake watershed. Jake folded the legal papers and fed them to the fire burning in his stone hearth. Watching the documents pearl and blacken felt satisfying, but ultimately pointless. More papers would come, backed by court orders and sheriff's deputies who followed the law, even when the law served injustice. That same evening, 70 miles away in the city.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Emma Carter was working her final shift at Whispering Pines Medical Center, unaware that her own confrontation with Blackstone's corporate machinery was about to begin. She moved through the hospital's cardiac unit with the efficient grace of someone who had spent 5 years learning to save lives under impossible conditions, checking monitors and adjusting medications for patients whose care had become secondary to profit margins. The medical center was part of Blackstone Healthcare, a subsidiary that had purchased rural hospitals across 3 states, promising improved services while systematically reducing staff and cutting corners on patient care. Emma had watched good doctors leave, seen experienced nurses replaced with undertrained temps, witnessed equipment failures that should have been prevented with proper maintenance. But tonight was different. Tonight, she had finally gathered enough evidence to prove what she had suspected for months. Blackstone Healthcare was deliberately understaffing critical units, manipulating patient records to hide preventable deaths, and billing insurance companies for treatments that were never provided. The evidence sat in encrypted files on her personal laptop, downloaded during her authorized access to the hospital's database system. Dr. Sarah Mitchell found Emma in the break room at 2 in the morning, staring at her laptop screen with the intensity of someone whose world was about to change forever. Sarah was one of the few doctors who had stayed after the Blackstone acquisition, fighting from within to maintain standards of care that corporate policies seemed designed to erode. "Working late again?" Sarah asked, pouring coffee that had been brewing since the previous shift. Emma looked up, recognizing something in Sarah's expression that suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "About what?" "About whether you've noticed the same patterns I have, about whether you think someone should do something about what's happening here." Sarah sat down across from Emma, her weathered face serious in the fluorescent light. At 55, she had seen enough hospital politics to recognize the weight of the question being asked. What kind of patterns? Emma turned her laptop screen so Sarah could see the spreadsheet she had compiled, rows of data that told a story of systematic negligence disguised as cost efficiency. Patient mortality rates had increased by 30% since Blackstone's acquisition. Readmission rates had doubled. Complaints about delayed treatment had tripled, but somehow the hospital's public ratings remained mysteriously high. "They're cooking the books," Emma said quietly, "transferring problem cases to other facilities before they can be counted against our statistics, discharging patients too early to reduce length of stay metrics. And, Sarah, I think they're billing for phantom treatments, procedures that never happened." Dr. Mitchell studied the data with the careful attention of someone whose signature appeared on life and death decisions every day. Emma had been thorough, cross-referencing patient records with billing statements, comparing staffing levels to recommended standards, documenting equipment failures that could have been prevented with proper maintenance budgets. "This is explosive," Sarah said finally. "If this is accurate, people have died because of deliberate cost-cutting. Families have been charged for treatments their loved ones never received. I know. That's why I can't just delete these files and pretend I never saw them." Sarah leaned back in her chair, understanding the implications of what Emma was considering. Whistleblowing against a corporation like Blackstone Healthcare meant career suicide at minimum, potential criminal charges if they decided to claim the evidence was obtained illegally. It also meant taking on a company with unlimited resources for legal warfare and a track record of destroying people who threatened their profits. "You could take this to the state medical board," Sarah suggested, though her tone suggested she knew how naive that sounded. "The same state medical board that approved Blackstone's acquisition despite community opposition? The one that's headed by Governor Patterson's former campaign manager?" Emma shook her head. "This needs to go to federal authorities, maybe the press, somewhere they can't buy or intimidate into silence." They sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that they were discussing something that would change everything. Emma had spent 5 years building her career at Whispering Pines, earning the respect of colleagues and the trust of patients who depended on her expertise. Sarah had devoted her entire professional life to healing, working within systems that sometimes made that mission difficult, but never impossible. Now they were contemplating war against an enemy with resources they could barely comprehend, motivated by a moral certainty that some things mattered more than personal safety. "If you do this," Sarah said finally, "you'll need help. Legal help, media contacts, people who understand how to fight corporations like Blackstone without getting crushed." Emma knew she had enough evidence to make a big story, but she needed help to share it safely.
Emma Carter was working her final shift at Whispering Pines Medical Center, unaware that her own confrontation with Blackstone's corporate machinery was about to begin. She moved through the hospital's cardiac unit with the efficient grace of someone who had spent 5 years learning to save lives under impossible conditions, checking monitors and adjusting medications for patients whose care had become secondary to profit margins. The medical center was part of Blackstone Healthcare, a subsidiary that had purchased rural hospitals across 3 states, promising improved services while systematically reducing staff and cutting corners on patient care. Emma had watched good doctors leave, seen experienced nurses replaced with undertrained temps, witnessed equipment failures that should have been prevented with proper maintenance. But tonight was different. Tonight, she had finally gathered enough evidence to prove what she had suspected for months. Blackstone Healthcare was deliberately understaffing critical units, manipulating patient records to hide preventable deaths, and billing insurance companies for treatments that were never provided. The evidence sat in encrypted files on her personal laptop, downloaded during her authorized access to the hospital's database system. Dr. Sarah Mitchell found Emma in the break room at 2 in the morning, staring at her laptop screen with the intensity of someone whose world was about to change forever. Sarah was one of the few doctors who had stayed after the Blackstone acquisition, fighting from within to maintain standards of care that corporate policies seemed designed to erode. "Working late again?" Sarah asked, pouring coffee that had been brewing since the previous shift. Emma looked up, recognizing something in Sarah's expression that suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "About what?" about whether you've noticed the same patterns I have, about whether you think someone should do something about what's happening here. Sarah sat down across from Emma, her weathered face serious in the fluorescent light. At 55, she had seen enough hospital politics to recognize the weight of the question being asked. What kind of patterns? Emma turned her laptop screen so Sarah could see the spreadsheet she had compiled. Rows of data that told the story of systematic negligence disguised as cost efficiency. Patient mortality rates had increased by 30% since Blackstone's acquisition. Readmission rates had doubled. Complaints about delayed treatment had tripled, but somehow the hospital's public ratings remained mysteriously high. "They're cooking the books," Emma said quietly, "transferring problem cases to other facilities before they can be counted against our statistics, discharging patients too early to reduce length of stay metrics. And Sarah, I think they're billing for phantom treatments, procedures that never happened." Dr. Mitchell studied the data with the careful attention of someone whose signature appeared on life-and-death decisions every day. Emma had been thorough, cross-referencing patient records with billing statements, comparing staffing levels to recommended standards, documenting equipment failures that could have been prevented with proper maintenance budgets. "This is explosive," Dr. Mitchell said finally. "If this is accurate, people have died because of deliberate cost-cutting. Families have been charged for treatments their loved ones never received." "I know. That's why I can't just delete these files and pretend I never saw them." Sarah leaned back in her chair, understanding the implications of what Emma was considering. Whistleblowing against a corporation like Blackstone Healthcare meant career suicide at minimum, potential criminal charges if they decided the claiming evidence was obtained illegally. It also meant taking on a company with unlimited resources for legal warfare and a track record of destroying people who threaten their profits. "You could take this to the state medical board," Sarah suggested, though her tone suggested she knew how naive that sounded. The same state medical board that approved Blackstone's acquisition despite community opposition? The one that's headed by Governor Patterson's former campaign manager? Emma shook her head. "This needs to go to federal authorities, maybe the press, somewhere they can't buy or intimidate into silence." They sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that they were discussing something that would change everything. Emma had spent 5 years building her career at Whispering Pines, earning the respect of colleagues and the trust of patients who depended on her expertise. Sarah had devoted her entire professional life to healing, working within systems that sometimes made that mission difficult but never impossible. Now they were contemplating war against an enemy with resources they could barely comprehend, motivated by a moral certainty that some things mattered more than personal safety. "If you do this," Sarah said finally, "you'll need help. Legal help, media contacts, people who understand how to fight corporations like Blackstone without getting crushed." Emma nodded, already knowing that her quiet life as a small-town nurse was about to end. The evidence on her laptop was too damning to ignore, the implications too serious to abandon. Somewhere in the data she had compiled were the names of patients who had died unnecessarily, families who had been lied to about their loved ones' care, workers who had been silenced or fired for trying to maintain professional standards. "I know someone," Sarah continued, "a journalist in Denver who's been investigating healthcare fraud, Maria Santos from the Post. She's good, and she's not afraid of powerful people." The plan formed gradually over the remaining hours of Emma's shift. She would copy the evidence to multiple secure locations, contact Maria Santos through encrypted channels, and prepare for the likelihood that Blackstone would discover her activities and respond with overwhelming force. Sarah would serve as a backup witness, someone who could corroborate Emma's findings if corporate lawyers tried to discredit her testimony. By sunrise, Emma was driving her 10-year-old Honda Civic toward the mountains, her laptop secure in a waterproof case, and her rearview mirror clear of the corporate security teams she knew would soon be following her. Her plan was simple: find somewhere remote enough to contact Maria Santos safely, transfer the evidence through secure channels, and wait for the story to break before returning to face whatever Blackstone had prepared. She had chosen the Crystal Lake area because it was isolated, sparsely populated, and far enough from the city to provide breathing room while she coordinated with journalists and federal investigators. The mountain roads were narrow and winding through pine forests and stretching up toward peaks that were still dusted with snow from late spring storms.
The corporate machinery that had devastated his own life. They killed my brother and stole my land. I've been fighting them alone for too long." The admission hung between them like an offered hand, an invitation to transform their individual struggles into something larger and more powerful than either could achieve separately. Emma felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the isolation that had defined her choice to risk everything for principle. For the first time since discovering the evidence that had changed everything, she wasn't alone in her fight against forces that seemed too powerful to defeat. This mountain man with gentle hands and warrior's eyes represented something she had thought no longer existed. Someone willing to stand against corruption regardless of personal cost. Outside, wind moved through the pines with the sound of approaching winter. Inside, two people who had been broken by the same corporate machine began planning their resistance, unaware that their enemies were already organizing forces that would test every aspect of their growing partnership. The ground beneath their feet was shifting, though they couldn't yet feel the magnitude of the earthquake their alliance would create. Jake watched Emma's fingers trace the rim of her coffee cup as dawn light filtered through the cabin's single window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. 3 days had passed since the corporate security team's midnight visit, and they had used the time to transform his simple mountain refuge into something resembling a fortress. Together, they had reinforced the door with steel brackets salvaged from old mining equipment, positioned emergency supplies at strategic locations, and established sight lines that would give them advance warning of approaching threats. The work had revealed capabilities in both of them that surprised the other. Emma's medical background translated into practical knowledge of trauma care and emergency preparedness, while her years working in high-stress hospital environments had taught her to think clearly under pressure. Jake's ranger training and 2 years of off-grid survival had made him expert at reading terrain, tracking movement through wilderness, and turning natural features into defensive advantages. More than practical skills, though, their collaboration had exposed the deeper compatibility that was growing between them. Emma moved through his space with instinctive respect for the careful organization that made isolated living possible, while Jake found himself anticipating her needs and preferences with an attention that went beyond simple courtesy. They were becoming partners in ways that extended far beyond their shared opposition to Blackstone Corporation. Emma set down her cup and moved to the window that overlooked the trail leading up from Cedar Falls. Her left shoulder was healing well under Jake's careful attention, the dislocation reduced and stabilized with techniques he had learned during wilderness first aid training. She wore one of his flannel shirts over thermal underwear, the practical clothing a far cry from the hospital scrubs that had defined her professional identity for 5 years. "I keep thinking about the patients," she said quietly, her breath fogging the cold glass. Mrs. Henderson in room 314, whose discharge was delayed 3 days because Blackstone was billing her insurance for a bed they needed for someone with better coverage. Mr. Kim, who died waiting for a cardiac procedure that got postponed because the equipment maintenance budget was cut to improve quarterly profits. Jake moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body, but careful not to crowd the space she needed to process the magnitude of what they were fighting. Through the window, they could see the pristine wilderness that surrounded his cabin, unmarked by the corporate machinery that was systematically destroying communities like Cedar Falls. "My brother Danny used to say that the hardest part wasn't knowing the system was broken," Jake said. "It was knowing that good people were trapped inside it, forced to choose between their principles and their survival." Emma turned to look at him, seeing the grief that still shadowed his features when he spoke about his brother. Over the past 3 days, she had learned to recognize the different qualities of silence that defined Jake's communication style. There was the comfortable quiet of shared work, the watchful silence of potential danger, and this deeper stillness that surrounded his memories of loss. "Tell me about him, about Danny." Jake's hands found the windowsill, his calloused fingers tracing patterns in the wood grain as he gathered memories that were easier to feel than speak. He was 2 years younger than me, but he always acted like the older brother. Couldn't see injustice without trying to fix it, couldn't watch someone suffer without getting involved. The story emerged slowly, revealed in fragments between longer silences. Danny Matthews had been a county mine inspector, one of the few officials willing to document safety violations, even when those violations involve powerful corporations with political connections. His job required him to crawl through tunnels where profit margins had been prioritized over worker safety, to document hazards that company engineers claimed didn't exist. He called me 3 days before the collapse, excited about something he'd found at Silver Creek Mine. Documents that proved Blackstone Mining knew about structural weaknesses, but ordered production to continue anyway. Emma felt her chest tighten as she recognized the pattern that connected Danny's death to her own discovery of corporate fraud. Different industries, different specific crimes, but the same fundamental corruption that put profits ahead of human life. The same willingness to silence witnesses who threatened quarterly earnings reports. The official investigation concluded that equipment failure caused the collapse. Faulty supports, inadequate ventilation, standard mining hazards that nobody could have predicted. Danny's body was recovered along with 4 other workers, but the documents he had mentioned were never found because they were destroyed in the collapse. Because they were removed before the collapse. Jake's voice carried quiet certainty, born of 18 months spent investigating his brother's death through unofficial channels. Someone went into that mine after Danny made his discoveries, but before the structural failure. Someone who knew exactly what to look for and where to find it. Emma was now being hunted for evidence of medical fraud, the same corporate empire, the same willingness to kill witnesses, the same systematic corruption of regulatory systems that should have protected workers and patients. Emma moved away from the window and retrieved her laptop from its secure location beneath Jake's bed. Over the past 3 days, she had been working to organize her evidence into formats that would be difficult for corporate lawyers to dismiss or discredit. The process required careful documentation of her access to hospital systems, timestamps that proved she had gathered information during authorized work shifts, and cross-references that supported every accusation with multiple sources. "I've been thinking about what happens next," she said, opening the laptop and navigating to encrypted folders that contained her life's work. "Even if we can get this evidence to federal authorities, even if Maria Santos publishes the story, Blackstone will claim everything was obtained illegally." Jake watched her fingers move across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, calling up spreadsheets and documents that represented months of careful investigation. He understood enough about corporate legal warfare to know that powerful companies could tie up evidence in court proceedings for years, long enough for public attention to fade and key witnesses to disappear or change their testimony. "What about other witnesses?" he asked. "Other people who've seen what you've seen but haven't spoken up yet?" Emma's expression brightened with possibility as she considered the suggestion. During her years at Whispering Pines Medical Center, she had developed relationships with nurses, technicians, and support staff who had witnessed the same systematic degradation of patient care. Most had remained silent out of fear for their jobs and families, but some might be willing to corroborate her testimony if they believed the risk was worthwhile. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell would testify," Emma said. "She's been fighting from inside the system, trying to maintain standards despite corporate pressure. And there are others, Linda Chen in billing, who's been forced to process fraudulent charges. Marcus Williams in maintenance, who's documented equipment failures that could have been prevented." Jake pulled out a notebook and pen, tools that had served him well during his ranger years when electronic devices were impractical for fieldwork. Together, they began compiling a list of potential allies, people whose testimony could transform Emma's individual accusations into a comprehensive indictment of systematic fraud. The process required Emma to relive the gradual recognition that her employer was deliberately harming patients for profit.
She described the statistical anomalies that had first caught her attention, the patterns of treatment delays and premature discharges that improved financial metrics while worsening health outcomes. Each example was supported by specific patient cases, names and faces that gave human dimension to corporate abstractions. "Mrs. Angela Foster," Emma said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. 73 years old, admitted with chest pain that indicated possible cardiac episode. Standard protocol required continuous monitoring and stress testing before discharge, but her insurance had a cap on cardiac care that we'd already reached. Jake watched Emma's face as she described how Mrs. Foster had been discharged with instructions to follow up with her primary care physician, despite warning signs that suggested ongoing cardiac instability. The woman had suffered a massive heart attack at home 3 days later, dying alone because her family couldn't afford private nursing care. The death certificate listed natural causes, Emma continued, coronary failure associated with advanced age. But I had access to her full medical records, and I knew that proper hospital monitoring would have detected the arterial blockage that killed her. Similar stories filled Emma's documentation, each representing a life lost or damaged by corporate policies that prioritized financial performance over medical necessity. Elderly patients discharged too early because extended stays reduced profitability. Surgical procedures delayed because operating room time was allocated based on insurance reimbursement rates rather than medical urgency. The systematic nature of the fraud was what made Emma's evidence so dangerous to Blackstone Healthcare. Individual cases of malpractice could be dismissed as isolated incidents, mistakes made by overworked staff under difficult conditions. But Emma had documented patterns that proved deliberate policy decisions, corporate directives that instructed medical professionals to prioritize financial considerations over patient welfare. "This is why they want you dead," Jake said bluntly, as he reviewed the scope of Emma's documentation. "Not just because you have evidence of fraud, but because you can prove it was intentional. You can show that people died because corporate executives decided their lives were worth less than quarterly profit margins." Emma nodded, understanding that the magnitude of her evidence was both her greatest weapon and her most serious vulnerability. Federal prosecutors would be interested in healthcare fraud that involved millions of dollars in false billings, but they would be fascinated by evidence of systematic policies that resulted in preventable deaths. "We need to get this to multiple sources simultaneously," she said. "Maria Santos at the Denver Post, but also federal authorities, state medical boards, and maybe congressional investigators. Make it impossible for Blackstone to suppress through legal pressure or intimidation." Jake stood and moved to a cabinet where he kept maps of the surrounding wilderness, detailed topographical charts that showed every trail, road, and landmark within 50 miles of his cabin. His years as a forest ranger had taught him that successful operations required understanding terrain better than potential opponents, knowing routes and hiding places that weren't marked on standard maps. "First, we need to get you somewhere safe while you make contact with these sources," he said, spreading maps across his kitchen table. "Somewhere Blackstone's security teams can't reach you, but close enough to civilization that you can coordinate with journalists and investigators." Emma studied the maps with growing appreciation for the complexity of mountain geography. The area around Crystal Lake was crisscrossed by hiking trails, logging roads, and abandoned mining tracks that offered dozens of potential routes between Jake's cabin and the outside world. Some led to other isolated homesteads, where sympathetic neighbors might provide temporary shelter. Others connected to backcountry camping areas
that were deserted during late autumn weather. "What about Haven Valley?" Jake suggested, pointing to a location about 15 miles north of his cabin. "There's an old ranger station there, abandoned since budget cuts, but still weatherproof. Solar panels for basic electricity, radio equipment that might still work. More importantly, it's accessible by ATV, but hidden from aerial surveillance." The plan began taking shape as they studied terrain features and potential escape routes. Emma would establish contact with Maria Santos from the relative security of the abandoned ranger station, using encrypted communications to transfer copies of her evidence. Meanwhile, Jake would return to Cedar Falls to make contact with potential witnesses, people who might be willing to support Emma's testimony if they understood the scope of the fight they were joining. "There's something else," Emma said, as they finalized details of their separation. "Something I haven't told you about Blackstone's corporate structure." Jake looked up from the map where he had been marking potential observation posts and defensive positions. recognizing the tone that suggested important information held in reserve until trust was fully established. Victor Blackstone doesn't just own healthcare facilities, Emma continued. Blackstone Corporation is a holding company with subsidiaries in mining, logging, real estate development, and government contracting. What happened to your brother, what's happening to patients at my hospital, it's all part of the same business model. The revelation connected patterns that Jake had been seeing but not fully understanding. The land grabs around Crystal Lake weren't isolated incidents, but part of the coordinated campaign to control natural resources and development opportunities. The regulatory corruption that had enabled unsafe mining practices was the same system that allowed fraudulent healthcare billing to continue unchecked. "They're building a monopoly," Jake said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Not just in one industry, but across every sector that affects rural communities. Healthcare, resource extraction, land development, even local government through campaign contributions and regulatory capture." Emma nodded, seeing that Jake grasped the implications immediately. "My evidence doesn't just prove healthcare fraud. It provides a template for investigating all of Blackstone's subsidiaries. If they're willing to falsify patient records for profit, they're probably manipulating safety reports, environmental assessments, and financial disclosures across their entire corporate empire." The scope of their opposition was larger than either had initially understood, but so was the potential impact of their resistance. Emma's evidence could provide the foundation for investigations that dismantled an entire network of corporate corruption, not just in healthcare, but across multiple industries where Blackstone's influence had distorted regulatory oversight. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the grief and rage that had defined his existence since Danny's death. For 18 months, he had been fighting a solitary war against forces that seemed too powerful and well-connected to defeat. Now he had found an ally whose expertise complemented his own, whose evidence could provide the breakthrough that transformed individual resistance into systematic justice. "When do we leave?" he asked, already knowing that their brief sanctuary at his cabin was ending. "Tomorrow morning," Emma replied, "before dawn, while we still have the advantage of surprise." They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for a separation that felt premature but necessary. Jake packed survival gear for Emma's journey to Haven Valley, including cold-weather clothing, emergency food supplies, and communication equipment that would allow them to maintain contact during their individual missions. Emma organized her evidence into multiple encrypted copies, ensuring that the loss of any single device wouldn't compromise the entire investigation. As evening approached, they worked together to prepare what might be their last meal in the cabin that had become their refuge. Jake cleaned fresh trout from his trap lines, while Emma prepared vegetables from his carefully maintained stores. The domestic routine felt both natural and precious, a glimpse of the life they might have built together under different circumstances. "I never asked you why you chose this place," Emma said, as they sat by the fire after dinner, their bodies warm against the cold that pressed against the cabin's walls. "Why you stayed here alone instead of rebuilding somewhere else?" Jake considered the question while flames danced in the stone hearth his grandfather had built with rocks gathered from Crystal Lake's shoreline. The cabin represented 3 generations of his family's connection to this specific landscape, but it also represented something more personal about his response to loss and betrayal. "After Danny died, I couldn't trust institutions anymore. The Forest Service, the county government, the legal system that was supposed to protect people like him, everything felt corrupted, compromised by corporate influence. Coming here was like going back to something fundamental, something that existed before money and politics complicated everything." Emma understood the appeal of isolation after experiencing the systematic corruption that had destroyed her faith in healthcare institutions. The simplicity of mountain living offered clarity that was impossible in environments where moral choices were constantly complicated by corporate policies and professional obligations. But isolation only works until the corruption reaches you anyway, until they come for your land or threaten people you care about. Jake nodded, recognizing the truth in her words.
His retreat to the mountain had provided temporary peace, but it hadn't solved the fundamental problem of corporate power that operated without accountability or constraint. The legal notice demanding his land had proven that geographical distance offered no real protection from systematic injustice. "Maybe that's why you found me," he said quietly. "Maybe isolation was never supposed to be permanent." Emma felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire's heat. Over the past 3 days, she had discovered that Jake's quiet competence masked depths of intelligence and moral courage that matched her commitment to principle over convenience. He was someone who could understand the magnitude of sacrifice required to fight corporate corruption, someone whose presence made her feel less alone in a struggle that had previously defined the boundaries of her world. "I used to think I was fighting for abstract principles, patient rights, medical ethics, professional standards. But sitting here with you, knowing what they did to your brother, what's happening to patients at my hospital, it's all personal now."
To Danny, understanding how many other people they've hurt, it feels more personal now. Jake turned to look at her, seeing firelight reflected in eyes that held both determination and vulnerability. Emma represented everything his isolated existence had lacked: intellectual partnership, shared purpose, and the possibility that love could grow from common cause rather than simple attraction. "Tomorrow we separate to fight the same war from different positions," he said. "But when this is over, when we've exposed what Blackstone has been doing, I want you to know that you'll always have a place here, with me." The words hung between them like a bridge across the uncertain future they faced. Emma felt her heart rate increase, not from fear, but from recognition that something profound was being offered. Jake wasn't just suggesting temporary alliance or convenient partnership, but the possibility of building something lasting from the connection that had formed between them. "Jake," she said softly, moving closer to him on the simple wooden bench where they sat. "When you found me in that snowdrift, when you chose to help instead of turning me over to authorities, did you know what you were risking?" He considered the question seriously, remembering the moment when he had seen her unconscious form buried in fresh snow. "I knew you were running from something dangerous. I knew helping you would probably bring that danger to my door. But I also knew that some choices defined who you are, and I couldn't live with myself if I walked away from someone who needed help." Emma reached for his hand, feeling the calluses that marked his years of physical labor, the strength that had carried her to safety when she was too weak to save herself. "I love you for that choice," she said simply, "for the man you proved yourself to be before I even knew your name." Jake felt something unlock in his chest, a door that had been barred since loss had taught him that caring for others only increased the potential for pain. Emma represented the possibility that love could be a source of strength rather than vulnerability, that partnership could multiply individual capability rather than creating additional weaknesses for enemies to exploit. He leaned forward and kissed her, tasting coffee and courage on lips that had whispered evidence of corporate crimes into encrypted files. The kiss deepened with mutual recognition that they were claiming something precious in the space between current danger and uncertain future, marking the transformation of alliance into love that was worth fighting for. When they separated, Emma rested her forehead against his, breathing the same air in the intimate space they had created. "Promise me something." "Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens tomorrow, no matter how dangerous this becomes, we don't sacrifice each other for the mission. We find a way to win that lets us both survive." Jake understood that she was asking him to choose love over vengeance, partnership over the solitary pursuit of justice that had defined his existence since Danny's death. It was a difficult promise, because corporate enemies like Blackstone were willing to kill witnesses and whistleblowers, because their fight would require risks that could destroy one or both of them. "I promise," he said finally. "We find a way to win together, or we don't win at all." Outside, wind carried the scent of snow that would arrive before morning, covering their tracks and providing natural concealment for the dangerous journey ahead. Inside, two people who had found love in the midst of war prepared for a separation that would test every aspect of their growing partnership. The fire burned lower as they held each other in silence, storing warmth and comfort against the cold challenges that waited beyond the cabin's protective walls. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and difficult choices, but tonight they had each other and the quiet certainty that some things were worth every risk required to protect them. The abandoned ranger station at Haven Valley sat like a forgotten monument to better times, its weathered log walls and solar panel array testament to an era when government actually funded wilderness protection. Emma approached the building through morning mist that clung to the valley floor, her breath forming clouds in air so cold it burned her lungs. Jake's ATV had carried her through 15 miles of backcountry trails in pre-dawn darkness, following routes that existed only in the memory of someone who had spent years learning every hidden path through these mountains. She had left him at sunrise, watching his silhouette disappear into pine shadows as he began his own dangerous journey back to Cedar Falls. The separation felt like tearing something essential from her chest, but they both understood that their missions required different skills and different risks. Emma needed technological resources and secure communications to coordinate with journalists and federal investigators. Jake needed to move through his former community, gathering allies among people who remembered him as a respected ranger before corporate corruption had made him a fugitive. The ranger station's interior smelled of dust and abandonment, but the solar electrical system still functioned, providing power for basic lighting and the radio equipment that represented her lifeline to the outside world. Emma spent the first hour testing communication systems and establishing her temporary command center on a desk that had once coordinated search and rescue operations across 3 counties. Her laptop connected to satellite internet through equipment that Jake had helped her install, creating an encrypted tunnel that would allow secure communication with Maria Santos and other potential allies. The technology felt strange in this isolated setting. Modern digital warfare conducted from a cabin that represented humanity's older relationship with wilderness. Emma's first encrypted message reached Maria Santos at the Denver Post newsroom, where the investigative journalist was reviewing corporate filings for a story about pharmaceutical pricing fraud. Maria had built her reputation exposing healthcare corruption, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the scope of evidence that began downloading to her secure server. The initial file transfer took 3 hours. Emma's documentation included not just statistical evidence of fraud, but video recordings of staff meetings where Blackstone executives explicitly discussed policies that prioritized profit over patient care. The recordings were legal because Emma had made them during authorized work sessions, but their content was explosive enough to bring down the entire corporate leadership structure. Maria's response came through encrypted channels that bounced through servers in 7 countries before reaching Emma's temporary sanctuary. The journalist's excitement palpable, even through layers of digital security, her message acknowledging that Emma's evidence represented the kind of systematic corporate malfeasance that could trigger federal investigations and congressional hearings. "This is bigger than healthcare fraud," Maria wrote. "If Blackstone is manipulating patient records to hide preventable deaths, they're probably falsifying safety reports across all their subsidiaries. Environmental assessments, mining safety documentation, construction permits, everything they touch becomes suspect." Emma felt validation wash through her as she realized that her individual courage in gathering evidence could expose corruption that extended far beyond Whispering Pines Medical Center. Maria's investigative experience allowed her to see patterns and connections that Emma had suspected but couldn't fully prove without access to Blackstone's other subsidiaries. The collaboration developed rapidly as Maria shared resources from her own investigations into corporate corruption. The journalist had been tracking suspicious patterns in federal contracting awards, environmental permit approvals, and regulatory enforcement actions that all seemed to benefit companies connected to Blackstone Corporation. Emma's healthcare evidence provided the missing piece that could prove systematic corruption rather than isolated incidents. Meanwhile, Jake was discovering that his return to Cedar Falls required navigating a community transformed by fear and economic pressure. The small town that had once welcomed him as a protector of wilderness resources now viewed him through the lens of corporate propaganda that painted him as a dangerous extremist who threatened local economic development. Tommy Chen at Miller's General Store greeted Jake with the nervous courtesy of someone caught between personal loyalty and business necessity. The store that had once been a gathering place for locals to share news and gossip now felt like a place where conversations were monitored and reported to corporate security teams that rewarded information about potential troublemakers. "Jake, you shouldn't be here," Tommy said quietly as he rang up basic supplies that Jake needed for his mission. "Word is that Blackstone's people are offering serious money for information about your whereabouts. Some folks are talking about collecting that reward." Jake understood that his former community was being torn apart by the same corporate machinery that had destroyed his family and threatened Emma's life. Blackstone's strategy involved more than direct intimidation. They were systematically corrupting social relationships that had once provided mutual support during difficult times. "What about Dr. Mitchell at the medical center?" Jake asked. "Is she still fighting corporate policies from the inside?" Tommy's expression grew more troubled as he considered the question. "Sarah's been pushing back against new protocols that seem designed to reduce patient care, but there are rumors that her contract won't be renewed, that Blackstone wants doctors who are more cooperative with cost-cutting measures." The information confirmed Emma's assessment that potential witnesses were under increasing pressure to remain silent or face career destruction. Jake realized that his mission would require more than simply gathering testimony. He would need to provide protection and support for people who chose principle over personal security. His first meeting with Dr. Sarah Mitchell took place in the medical center's parking lot at shift change when hospital traffic provided cover for conversations that couldn't be overheard by corporate security personnel. Sarah approached Jake's truck with the cautious determination of someone who had been expecting this contact ever since Emma's disappearance had become local news. "She made it out safely?" Sarah asked, without preamble, her medical training making her efficient with essential information. "She's secure and coordinating with federal investigators," Jake confirmed, "but she needs corroborating testimony from people who've witnessed the same systematic fraud she documented." Sarah's weathered face reflected the internal struggle of someone whose entire career had been devoted to healing within institutions that were increasingly hostile to that mission. At 55, she had invested 3 decades in building professional relationships and patient trust that would be destroyed if she publicly challenged Blackstone's corporate policies. "They're implementing new protocols next week," she said finally. "Computer systems that will automatically recommend discharge for patients whose insurance reaches predetermined limits. The recommendations will be presented as medical decisions, but they're purely financial calculations." Jake felt anger rise in his chest as he understood the implications of what Sarah was describing. Blackstone was systemizing the corruption that Emma had documented, creating technological infrastructure that would make fraudulent decision-making appear like routine medical practice. "Emma has evidence that proves the current system is deliberately harming patients," Jake said. "Your testimony could show that the corruption is expanding rather than being corrected." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus Williams, the maintenance supervisor, whose documentation of equipment failures had provided crucial evidence for Emma's investigation. Marcus approached with the careful casualness of someone who understood that being seen talking to Jake Matthews could result in immediate termination and blacklisting from future employment. "Heard through the grapevine that someone's finally taken on Blackstone directly. About time somebody with resources decided to fight back." Jake recognized that Marcus had made assumptions about external support that weren't entirely accurate, but he also understood that perception of strength was crucial for gathering allies in a fight against overwhelming corporate power. People needed to believe that resistance was possible before they would risk everything to support it. "We need documentation of deliberate equipment failures," Jake said. "Evidence that shows Blackstone is cutting maintenance budgets in ways that endanger patient safety." Marcus nodded, reaching into his work jacket to retrieve a folded envelope that bulged with papers and photographs. "I've been keeping records for 2 years, ever since they started ignoring my repair requests for critical equipment. Cardiac monitors that haven't been serviced in 18 months. surgical equipment that's operating beyond manufacturer's safety recommendations, backup generators that haven't been tested since the corporate takeover. The envelope represented another piece of the systematic evidence that Emma and Maria
Santos were assembling into a comprehensive indictment of corporate malfeasance. Jake understood that each witness who chose to speak represented not just individual courage, but collective resistance to forces that sought to reduce human welfare to quarterly profit margins. Linda Chen from the billing department joined their impromptu meeting, arriving with the nervous energy of someone who had been wrestling with moral decisions that kept her awake at night. As Tommy Chen's sister, she had grown up in Cedar Falls and understood the community connections that make corporate corruption particularly devastating to small-town social fabric. "They want me to process bills for treatments that were never provided," Linda said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "Phantom procedures, inflated medication costs, charges for equipment that was never used. When I questioned the discrepancies, my supervisor told me that questioning corporate billing practices was grounds for immediate termination." Jake realized that they were witnessing the formation of something larger than individual testimony. These healthcare workers were discovering that their isolated experiences of corporate pressure were part of a systematic campaign that affected every aspect of patient care. The recognition was transforming individual frustration into collective resistance. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with the authority of someone whose medical training had prepared her to make life-and-death decisions under pressure. "If we're going to do this, we need to coordinate our testimony so that Blackstone can't dismiss us as disgruntled employees making isolated complaints." The planning session that followed transformed the hospital parking lot into an impromptu war room where healthcare professionals shared evidence of systematic fraud that extended across every department of Whispering Pines Medical Center. Marcus provided documentation of equipment failures that had resulted in delayed diagnoses and extended patient suffering. Linda shared billing records that proved deliberate overcharging for services that were never provided. Dr. Mitchell contributed medical assessments that showed how corporate cost-cutting policies had directly caused preventable patient deaths. Jake coordinated the testimony with the tactical precision he had learned during Ranger training, ensuring that each witness understood their role in a larger strategy while maintaining operational security that would protect them from corporate retaliation before their evidence could be officially recorded. "Emma is working with Maria Santos at the Denver Post to ensure this story gets national attention," Jake explained. "But we also need to coordinate with federal healthcare fraud investigators and state medical licensing boards. Multiple simultaneous investigations will make it impossible for Blackstone to suppress evidence through legal pressure." The group dispersed with careful timing that avoided drawing attention from corporate security personnel who monitored hospital facilities for signs of employee disloyalty. Each participant carried encrypted communication devices that Jake had provided, creating a network that could coordinate resistance activities while maintaining the operational security necessary for success. Jake's final meeting in Cedar Falls took place at the Broken Wheel Diner, where Pastor David Wilson had been waiting since the lunch rush ended, and the restaurant was mostly empty except for truckers passing through on their way to distant destinations. The pastor represented community moral authority that could provide legitimacy for resistance activities that corporate propaganda would try to paint as extremist or anti-business. David Wilson was a man whose 40 years of ministry had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate authority and systematic oppression. His small congregation included many of the families whose lives had been disrupted by corporate expansion into Cedar Falls, and his pastoral duties had given him intimate knowledge of how corporate policies affected real people trying to survive and care for their loved ones. The Henderson family lost their grandmother because Blackstone delayed her cardiac surgery for 3 weeks while they negotiated with her insurance company, Pastor Wilson said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had comforted too many families whose losses could have been prevented. Mrs. Henderson died waiting for treatment that should have been provided immediately. Jake understood that Pastor Wilson's testimony would carry weight with investigators and journalists who needed to understand the human cost of corporate fraud. Religious leaders were often trusted sources when secular authorities wanted to verify that community complaints represented genuine grievances rather than political opposition to business development. "We're asking people to risk their jobs and their safety to expose this corruption," Jake said. "As someone who provides spiritual guidance to this community, do you believe the risk is justified?"
Pastor Wilson considered the question with the serious attention he brought to all moral decisions that affected his congregation. Scripture teaches us that we have obligations to protect the vulnerable and speak truth to power, even when that truth brings persecution. The question isn't whether the risk is justified, but whether we can live with ourselves if we remain silent while people die from preventable corporate negligence. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Frank Rodriguez, the local sheriff whose law enforcement responsibilities had brought him into increasing conflict with corporate security teams that operated according to rules that seemed to supersede local authority. Frank had known Jake since they were both young men, learning to navigate the complex relationship between wilderness protection and community economic development. "Jake, I need to tell you that I've got federal marshals asking questions about your whereabouts," Frank said, sliding into the booth with the careful movement of someone whose duty required him to deliver unwelcome news to an old friend. "Word is that there are federal warrants related to the mining equipment arson that happened after Danny's death." Jake felt cold certainty settle in his stomach as he understood that Blackstone had escalated their campaign beyond economic pressure and intimidation. Federal charges meant that his fight against corporate corruption would now be complicated by the need to avoid arrest and prosecution for crimes he hadn't committed but couldn't easily disprove. "The arson happened 3 months after Danny died. I was dealing with his funeral and estate issues, not plotting sabotage against mining equipment." "I know that, and I'll testify to it if necessary," Frank replied. "But federal charges mean that they need to know you can't bin cocaine."
Prosecutors have evidence that they claim links you to the incident. Witness testimony, forensic analysis, financial records that supposedly show you purchasing materials used in the explosives. Pastor Wilson leaned forward with the intensity of someone whose understanding of justice had been shaped by decades of witnessing both human dignity and systematic oppression. This is what they do to people who threaten their profits. They manufacture evidence, corrupt legal processes, and use federal law enforcement to silence whistleblowers. Jake realized that his mission in Cedar Falls was ending, whether he wanted it to or not. Federal warrants meant that every minute he remained in public increased the risk of arrest that would neutralize his ability to support Emma's investigation. Worse, his capture could be used to discredit their evidence by painting their resistance as criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate whistleblowing. "I need to get back to Emma," Jake said, understanding that their separation had become more dangerous than either had anticipated. "But the testimony we've gathered today can support federal investigations even if I'm not available to coordinate personally." Frank Rodriguez reached into his sheriff's jacket and retrieved a small digital device that looked like a standard radio but contained encryption capabilities that would allow secure communication with federal law enforcement agencies that weren't compromised by corporate influence. Maria Santos provided this through her contacts at the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division, Frank explained. Direct communication with investigators who specialize in cases involving systematic corporate corruption. They're already interested in Blackstone based on preliminary evidence that Maria shared with them. The device represented hope that their fight against corporate corruption could transition from desperate resistance to official investigation with federal resources and legal authority. Jake understood that Emma's evidence, combined with testimony from Cedar Falls healthcare workers, could provide the foundation for prosecutions that would dismantle Blackstone's entire network of fraudulent business practices. Pastor Wilson offered a brief prayer for protection and justice as their meeting concluded, his words carrying the authority of someone whose faith had been tested by witnessing both human dignity and systematic oppression. The blessing felt like armor against the corporate forces that sought to reduce their struggle to criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate resistance against institutional corruption. Jake left Cedar Falls with more evidence and allies than he had dared hope for, but also with the knowledge that Blackstone's response was escalating beyond economic pressure to direct legal warfare designed to neutralize their opposition. The drive back to Haven Valley through mountain wilderness felt like traveling between two worlds, one where corporate power operated without constraint and another where individual courage could still make a difference. The encrypted radio crackled with Emma's voice as he navigated the final miles of backcountry trails that led to their temporary reunion. Her tone carried excitement and urgency as she reported successful contact with federal investigators who were prepared to move quickly on evidence of systematic healthcare fraud. Maria Santos has convinced the FBI Healthcare Fraud Division to open a formal investigation, Emma reported through encrypted channels. They want to interview our witnesses within 48 hours before Blackstone realizes how much evidence we've gathered. Jake felt hope and fear compete in his chest as he understood that their resistance had reached the point where success and destruction were equally possible outcomes. Federal investigation offered the possibility of justice that neither could achieve individually, but it also meant exposure to corporate retaliation that could destroy their lives even if their mission succeeded. The reunion at Haven Valley felt like coming home after a journey through hostile territory, Emma's embrace providing warmth and comfort that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the ranger station's stone hearth. They had both survived their individual missions, but the intelligence they had gathered made clear that their most dangerous challenges lay ahead. Night fell over the valley as they shared their discoveries and planned their next moves. Two people who had found love in the midst of war, now preparing for battles that would determine not just their own survival, but the possibility of justice for countless victims of corporate corruption. The ground beneath their feet was shifting, and they could feel the magnitude of the earthquake their alliance was creating. The federal courthouse in Denver rose against the October sky like a fortress of glass and steel, its modern architecture reflecting the corporate towers that surrounded it in the city's business district. Emma Carter walked up the courthouse steps with the measured pace of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment, her testimony folders secured in a briefcase that contained enough evidence to dismantle an entire corporate empire. 3 weeks had passed since the FBI Healthcare Fraud Division had opened their formal investigation into Blackstone Corporation, and the speed of federal response had surprised even Maria Santos, whose experience with government bureaucracy had taught her to expect delays and obstruction when powerful corporations were involved. The evidence Emma and Jake had gathered was so comprehensive and damaging that federal prosecutors had fast-tracked indictments that normally took months to prepare. Jake waited in the courthouse lobby, his presence a calculated risk that they had debated extensively during their final days at Haven Valley. The federal warrants against him remained active, but his attorney had negotiated protective custody arrangements that allowed him to testify without being arrested on the fabricated charges that Blackstone had orchestrated through corrupt federal prosecutors who were now themselves under investigation. The past 3 weeks had transformed their desperate resistance into a coordinated federal case that involved multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division was working with the Environmental Protection Agency to investigate safety violations at Blackstone's mining operations. The Securities and Exchange Commission was examining financial disclosures that seemed to hide systematic fraud across multiple subsidiaries. Congressional investigators were reviewing federal contracts that appeared to involve illegal bid rigging and regulatory capture. Emma's testimony would anchor the healthcare fraud charges, but Jake's evidence about his brother's death had opened investigations into industrial safety violations that extended far
beyond the Silver Creek mine collapse. Danny Matthews had died gathering evidence of systematic negligence. But his brother's pursuit of justice had finally reached authorities with the power and resources to hold corporate criminals accountable. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the courthouse flanked by FBI agents who had provided protection after Blackstone's security teams had attempted to intimidate her into silence. Her medical testimony would corroborate Emma's evidence that corporate policies had directly caused preventable patient deaths, transforming abstract fraud charges into criminal negligence that carried serious prison sentences. Marcus Williams and Linda Chen had provided documentation that proved Blackstone's fraud was systematic rather than accidental, their evidence showing deliberate policies designed to maximize profits through false billing and deferred maintenance that endangered patient safety. Pastor David Wilson's testimony would establish community impact, demonstrating how corporate corruption had devastated families whose loved ones had died from preventable medical negligence. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Morrison, whose reputation for aggressive pursuit of corporate crime had made her Blackstone's worst nightmare. Morrison had built her career dismantling complex fraud schemes that involved multiple jurisdictions and sophisticated money laundering operations. Her team included forensic accountants, medical experts, and technology specialists who understood how modern corporations used legitimate business structures to hide criminal activity. Victor Blackstone arrived at the courthouse in a convoy of black SUVs that carried enough corporate security personnel to suggest he considered himself under siege. The billionaire businessman who had built his empire through regulatory capture and systematic corruption now faced federal charges that could result in decades in federal prison. His legal team included some of the most expensive white-collar defense attorneys in the country, but even unlimited resources couldn't overcome the weight of evidence that Emma and Jake had assembled. The courtroom filled with journalists, federal investigators, and family members of victims whose deaths had been caused by Blackstone's corporate policies. Emma recognized Mrs. Henderson's daughter, whose mother had died waiting for cardiac surgery that Blackstone had delayed for financial reasons. Marcus Williams' wife sat beside Linda Chen's family, representing the community of healthcare workers who had chosen principle over job security. Judge Patricia Chambers called the proceedings to order with the authoritative presence of someone whose 30 years on the federal bench had prepared her to handle cases involving both complex corporate law and fundamental questions of justice. Her reputation for fairness and intolerance of legal manipulation had made her assignment to the Blackstone case a victory for federal prosecutors who knew that corporate defense teams would attempt every possible delay and obstruction. Emma took the witness stand with the calm confidence of someone whose expertise had been tested under fire and proven sound. Her medical background allowed her to explain complex healthcare fraud in terms that jurors could understand, while her months of investigation had given her command of evidence that defense attorneys couldn't discredit or dismiss. Mrs. Carter, Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison began, "Please tell the court about your employment at Whispering Pines Medical Center and what you observed regarding patient care policies implemented after Blackstone Healthcare's acquisition." Emma's testimony unfolded like a medical case study, each example supported by documentation that showed how corporate policies had systematically prioritized profit over patient welfare. She described the computer algorithms that recommended premature discharge for patients whose insurance coverage had reached predetermined limits. She detailed the billing practices that charged families for treatments that were never provided. She documented the equipment maintenance deferrals that had resulted in diagnostic delays and surgical complications. In your professional opinion, Morrison continued, were these policies designed to improve patient care or to increase corporate profits? The policies were explicitly designed to maximize revenue while minimizing costs, Emma replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose conclusions were based on exhaustive evidence. Patient welfare was never a consideration in the decision-making process. In fact, several internal memos specifically stated that optimal financial performance required reducing what corporate executives called unnecessary compassionate care. The defense team's cross-examination attempted to portray Emma as a disgruntled employee whose accusations were motivated by personal grievances rather than genuine concern for patient welfare. The strategy collapsed when Morrison introduced recordings of corporate meetings where Blackstone executives discussed policies they knew would result in preventable deaths, but justified as necessary for competitive profitability. Jake's testimony connected healthcare fraud to the broader pattern of corporate corruption that had killed his brother and threatened countless other workers in Blackstone's mining and construction subsidiaries. His evidence about Danny's death had triggered parallel investigations that revealed systematic safety violations designed to reduce operational costs, regardless of worker safety. "Mr. Matthews," Morrison asked, "what did your brother tell you about the documents he had discovered at Silver Creek Mine?" Danny said he had found evidence that Blackstone Mining knew about structural weaknesses that made the mine dangerous for workers. He said the company had received engineering reports recommending immediate closure of affected areas, but had ordered continued production because temporary shutdown would reduce quarterly profits.
The defense team's attempts to discredit Jake's testimony were undermined by documentary evidence that federal investigators had recovered from Blackstone's corporate files. The company had indeed received engineering reports that warned of imminent structural failure, but had chosen to conceal those reports rather than implement safety measures that would have saved Danny's life and the lives of 5 other workers. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's medical testimony provided clinical context for Emma's fraud evidence, explaining how corporate cost-cutting policies had directly caused patient deaths that could have been prevented with appropriate medical care.
Gave her testimony authoritative weight that defense attorneys couldn't challenge without attacking the fundamental principles of medical practice. Marcus Williams documented equipment failures that had endangered patients, while corporate executives received performance bonuses for reducing maintenance costs. His maintenance records showed that critical medical equipment had been allowed to deteriorate beyond manufacturers' safety recommendations, resulting in diagnostic delays and surgical complications that could have been prevented with proper investment in patient safety. Linda Chen's billing documentation proved that Blackstone had systematically charged patients and insurance companies for treatments that were never provided, generating millions of dollars in fraudulent revenue that had been used to pay executive bonuses while actual patient care was systematically degraded. Pastor David Wilson's testimony established the community impact of corporate policies that had destroyed families and eroded social trust in medical institutions. His pastoral experience had given him intimate knowledge of how corporate fraud had affected real people whose stories provided human context for abstract financial crimes. The prosecution's case concluded with financial experts who explained how Blackstone's fraud had been systematized across multiple subsidiaries, creating a corporate culture that prioritized short-term profits over legal compliance or ethical responsibility. Forensic accountants detailed money laundering schemes that had hidden fraudulent revenue through complex transactions involving offshore accounts and shell companies. Victor Blackstone's defense team attempted to portray their client as a legitimate businessman whose company's policies had been misinterpreted by disgruntled employees and overzealous federal prosecutors. The strategy collapsed under the weight of evidence that showed deliberate criminal activity rather than aggressive but legal business practices. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Blackstone himself took the witness stand, his arrogance and entitlement on full display as he attempted to justify policies that had killed patients and workers while generating hundreds of millions in fraudulent profits. His testimony revealed a man who genuinely believed that corporate profits justified any level of human suffering, that economic efficiency excused criminal negligence. "Mr. Blackstone," Morrison asked during cross-examination, "were you aware that your company's policies had resulted in preventable patient deaths?" "Business decisions sometimes have unfortunate consequences," Blackstone replied, his tone suggesting that patient deaths were acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of corporate profitability. "We can't save everyone, and attempts to do so would bankrupt the healthcare system." The callousness of his response shocked even experienced court observers who had witnessed decades of corporate crime. Blackstone's words were quoted in news reports that transformed public opinion against corporate executives who viewed human life as expendable when it conflicted with financial objectives. The trial deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts of healthcare fraud, criminal negligence, and conspiracy to commit murder. Victor Blackstone received a sentence of 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, while his corporate co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. The financial penalties imposed on Blackstone Corporation exceeded $2 billion, including restitution to victims' families and fines that effectively bankrupted the company's fraudulent subsidiaries. Federal oversight of remaining operations ensured that patient care would be prioritized over corporate profits, while new regulations made systematic healthcare fraud much more difficult to conceal. Emma and Jake stood on the courthouse steps as media crews recorded their statements about a case that had exposed corruption reaching the highest levels of corporate leadership. The investigation had triggered reforms that extended far beyond healthcare, establishing precedents for holding corporate executives personally accountable for criminal policies implemented in pursuit of profit. This case proves that corporate criminals can be held accountable when communities have the courage to resist systematic oppression, Emma told reporters whose questions reflected genuine interest in understanding how individual whistleblowing had triggered such comprehensive federal action. But the real victory belongs to the families whose loved ones died from preventable corporate negligence. Their suffering demanded justice, and today they received it. Jake's statement focused on the broader implications of their victory for rural communities that faced corporate predation across multiple industries. Companies like Blackstone depend on isolation and intimidation to silence witnesses and victims. He said, "When communities work together to document corporate crimes and support federal investigations, even the most powerful corporations can't escape accountability." The months following the trial brought changes that transformed both their personal lives and the communities they had fought to protect. Emma returned to nursing at a community health center that prioritized patient care over corporate profits, her experience with federal investigation making her a sought-after expert on healthcare fraud prevention. Her testimony had triggered reforms that made systematic billing fraud much more difficult to conceal, while new whistleblower protections encouraged healthcare workers to report corporate policies that endangered patient safety. Jake reclaimed his family's land through federal legislation that invalidated property seizures based on fraudulent tax assessments, but chose to donate most of the acreage to environmental conservation that would prevent future corporate exploitation. His expertise in corporate corruption made him valuable to federal agencies that investigated systematic fraud in industries that affected rural communities. Their wedding took place at Crystal Lake in late spring, surrounded by friends and allies who had supported their fight against corporate corruption. Pastor David Wilson performed the ceremony with words that reflected their shared commitment to justice and community service. Dr. Sarah Mitchell served as Emma's maid of honor, while Tommy Chen and Marcus Williams stood with Jake as groomsmen who had risked everything to support their resistance. The cabin that had served as their refuge during the darkest period of their fight against corporate corruption became their permanent home, expanded and modernized, but retaining the connection to wilderness that had provided sanctuary when corporate enemies seemed too powerful to defeat. Solar panels and satellite
Internet allowed them to maintain contact with ongoing investigations and reform efforts, while the isolation provided peace and privacy for building their life together. Emma's pregnancy announcement came during their first anniversary celebration, shared news that represented hope for a future where corporate corruption would face systematic resistance from communities that refused to accept systematic oppression. Their child would grow up in a world where whistleblowing was protected, where corporate executives faced real consequences for criminal policies, where love and partnership could triumph over forces that sought to reduce human dignity to profit margins. The legal precedents established by the Blackstone case had triggered investigations into corporate corruption across multiple industries, with federal prosecutors using Emma and Jake's model of comprehensive evidence gathering to dismantle fraud schemes that had operated for decades without accountability. Healthcare reform, mining safety regulations, and environmental protection measures all reflected lessons learned from their successful resistance to systematic corporate oppression.
Jake built a workshop where he crafted furniture from fallen trees that littered the forest around their home, his hands creating beauty from natural materials that represented renewal rather than exploitation. Emma established a telemedicine practice that served rural communities whose healthcare needs had been neglected by corporate providers focused on urban markets with better profit margins. Their evening conversations often returned to the miracle of their meeting and the transformation that had resulted from their decision to fight together rather than separately. Two broken people who'd been isolated by corporate oppression had discovered that love could multiply individual strength into collective power capable of achieving justice that neither could have imagined alone. The mountain wilderness that surrounded their home had become a symbol of resistance to corporate forces that sought to transform everything into commodity rather than recognizing intrinsic value that couldn't be measured in quarterly profit reports. Crystal Lake reflected sunset colors that reminded them daily of beauty that existed independent of human exploitation, natural wealth that belonged to communities rather than distant shareholders. Emma's medical practice brought her into contact with families whose lives had been disrupted by corporate policies that prioritized efficiency over human welfare, while Jake's consulting work exposed him to communities across the region that faced similar challenges from different corporate predators. Their experience with successful resistance provided hope and practical guidance for people who had previously felt powerless against systematic oppression. The documentary film about their case had been nominated for an Academy Award, bringing national attention to issues of corporate accountability and rural community resistance that mainstream media had previously ignored. Emma and Jake served as executive producers, ensuring that profits from the film supported organizations that provided legal assistance to whistleblowers and communities fighting corporate corruption. Their story had become part of a broader movement that challenged corporate impunity and demanded accountability from executives whose policies affected millions of people who had no voice in boardroom decisions that determined their welfare. Law schools taught case studies based on their investigation, while business schools examined their resistance as an example of how individual courage could trigger systematic institutional change. The child growing in Emma's womb would inherit a world where corporate crime faced serious consequences, where communities had legal protections against systematic exploitation, where love between partners could become the foundation for social movements that achieved justice for entire populations. Their personal victory had created precedents that would protect countless families from the kind of corporate predation they had faced and overcome. Winter returned to the mountains with snow that covered their land in white silence, but the cold no longer represented isolation or desperation. Instead, it provided peaceful beauty for two people who had discovered that individual love could become collective strength, that resistance to oppression could triumph when courage found partnership and purpose found community support. They sat by their fire on winter evenings, Emma's hand resting on the growing life within her, while Jake's calloused fingers traced the wedding ring that symbolized promises kept under impossible pressure. The flames danced with light that illuminated faces marked by struggle, but softened by contentment that came from knowing their fight had mattered beyond their personal happiness. The mountain man had found his woman in a blizzard of corporate corruption and personal devastation. Together, they had built love that survived every test their enemies could devise, partnership that multiplied their individual strength into collective power that achieved justice for countless victims of systematic oppression. Their story would inspire future generations who face similar choices between personal safety and moral courage, between isolated survival and collective resistance. The ground beneath their feet was no longer frozen with despair and isolation. Something permanent and beautiful had grown from their courage, something that would survive whatever storms the future might bring, something worth every sacrifice they had made to protect and nurture into lasting victory. 5 years after the Blackstone trials, Emma Matthews stood in the delivery room of the new Cedar Falls Community Medical Center, her skilled hands guiding another life into the world, while Jake waited in their cabin 12 miles away, putting finishing touches on a cradle he had carved from mountain pine. The hospital had been rebuilt with federal funding that ensured community ownership rather than corporate control, its policies designed by healthcare professionals rather than profit-maximizing executives. The baby's first cry echoed through a facility that embodied everything Emma and Jake had fought to protect. Patient care took precedence over billing optimization. Medical decisions were made by doctors and nurses rather than insurance algorithms. The equipment was maintained to manufacturer specifications rather than deferred until breakdown threatened patient safety. It was healthcare as it should be, funded by communities that understood healing required investment rather than extraction. Dr. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the surgery where she had just completed a cardiac procedure that would have been delayed indefinitely under Blackstone's profit. Protocols at 60 had become the medical center's chief of staff, her leadership ensuring that the facility maintained the highest standards of patient care while remaining financially sustainable through community support rather than corporate manipulation. Another successful delivery, Sarah announced to the nursing staff who had gathered to celebrate the birth of Cedar Falls' newest resident. Emma's expertise continues to make these mountain births safer for both mothers and babies. The medical center employed 12 nurses, 6 doctors, and 30 support staff who had been trained in patient-centered care that prioritized healing over profit margins. Many were refugees from corporate healthcare systems that had prioritized efficiency over effectiveness, professionals who had rediscovered their calling in an environment that supported their commitment to healing rather than punishing it. Emma cleaned her hands with the methodical precision that 5 years of mountain deliveries had perfected, her movements efficient but unhurried in the way that came from working without corporate pressure to maximize patient turnover. Each birth she attended represented not just new life, but validation of the healthcare system they had fought to create, proof that medicine could serve communities rather than shareholders. The drive home took her through Cedar Falls Main Street, which had been revitalized through federal investment that followed the Blackstone prosecutions. Tommy Chen's general store had expanded into a regional supplier for mountain communities that had been underserved by corporate chains focused on urban markets. The Broken Wheel Diner had become a gathering place for community meetings that coordinated regional resistance to corporate exploitation attempts. Miller's Hardware had grown into a cooperative that provided employment for displaced miners who had retrained in sustainable technologies that supported community development rather than resource extraction. The bookstore that had opened next to Pastor Wilson's church specialized in literature about community organizing and environmental protection, serving readers throughout the mountain region who were building alternative economic systems. Emma's satellite phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Maria Santos, whose investigative journalism had expanded into a nonprofit organization that supported communities fighting corporate corruption. The message contained an invitation to speak at a national conference about whistleblowing and community resistance, part of the ongoing movement that had grown from their successful challenge to Blackstone's systematic fraud. The cabin that had once served as their refuge now functioned as headquarters for consulting work that helped communities across the region develop resistance strategies against corporate predators who sought to exploit natural resources and human labor. Jake's expertise in wilderness survival had evolved into knowledge about sustainable community development that could resist corporate pressure while maintaining economic viability. Their 3-year-old daughter Katie played in the workshop where Jake was sanding the cradle that would welcome their second child in 2 months. She'd inherited her mother's careful attention to detail and her father's instinctive understanding of natural systems, spending hours observing wildlife and learning to identify plants that provided food and medicine for mountain communities. "Mama's home," Katie announced with the excited certainty of someone whose world was defined by routines that provided security and predictability. Her childhood was unfolding in an environment where adult stress came from challenging work rather than desperate survival, where community support provided safety nets that corporate systems had systematically dismantled. Jake looked up from his woodworking with the smile that still made Emma's heart accelerate after 5 years of marriage. His hands had healed from the calluses of desperate subsistence living, softened by work that created rather than merely survived. The chronic tension that had marked his features during their fight against Blackstone had been replaced by contentment that came from meaningful work and loving partnership. "How was the delivery?" he asked, setting down his tools to embrace the woman who had transformed his isolated existence into a life worth living. "Perfect," Emma replied, breathing in the scent of pine shavings and wood stain that marked Jake's creative work. "Dr. Mitchell says the medical center is achieving outcomes that surpass any corporate facility in the region. Community investment in healthcare actually works better than profit-driven systems." Their evening conversation unfolded while Katie helped prepare dinner from vegetables they had grown in gardens that supplied fresh food throughout the growing season. The 3-year-old's questions about baby animals and plant growth revealed curiosity about natural systems that would serve her well in a world where environmental literacy was becoming essential for community survival. Emma's pregnancy was progressing smoothly under Sarah Mitchell's care, monitored with equipment that was maintained to the highest standards rather than deferred until failure threatened patient safety. The baby was due in late winter, timing that would allow Emma to take maternity leave during the season when mountain births were least frequent. Jake had completed the nursery in their cabin's expanded second floor, handcrafted furniture reflecting his growing skill as a woodworker whose pieces were sought by families throughout the region. His work provided income that supplemented Emma's nursing salary and consulting fees, creating financial security that didn't depend on corporate employment or urban markets. The consulting practice they had built together specialized in helping communities document corporate environmental and safety violations that could support federal investigations. Their experience with systematic evidence gathering had proven valuable to groups fighting mining companies, logging operations, and development projects that threatened local ecosystems and community welfare. Emma's expertise in healthcare fraud had made her a consultant for federal agencies that investigated corporate medical systems suspected of systematic patient abuse. Her testimony had supported prosecutions of 3 other corporate healthcare corporations whose executives are now serving federal prison sentences for policies that prioritized profits over patient welfare.
Land grabs much more difficult to execute and easier to challenge in federal court. Their success had generated speaking invitations from universities, law schools, and community organizations that wanted to understand how individual resistance could trigger systematic institutional change. Emma's presentations focused on the technical aspects of documenting corporate fraud, while Jake addressed the psychological and practical challenges of sustaining resistance against overwhelming corporate pressure. The documentary about their case had won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, bringing national attention to issues of corporate accountability and rural community resistance. Profits from the film had funded legal assistance programs that provided representation for whistleblowers and communities fighting corporate exploitation across multiple industries. Katie's bedtime story that evening came from a children's book that Emma had written about communities working together to protect natural resources from corporate exploitation. The story featured characters based on people they had worked with during their fight against Blackstone, transformed into animal characters that taught lessons about courage, cooperation, and environmental protection. "Will the baby like stories too?" Katie asked as Emma tucked her into bed beneath quilts that had been made by community members, whose traditional crafts had been revived as alternatives to mass-produced consumer goods. "The baby will love stories," Emma replied, "especially stories about brave people who work together to protect the things they care about." The quiet that followed Katie's sleep allowed Emma and Jake to review plans for the Community Resilience Conference they were organizing for spring, when mountain weather would allow participants to travel from across the region. The conference would bring together environmental lawyers, healthcare advocates, mining safety experts, and community organizers who were building networks that could resist corporate exploitation through coordinated action. Federal legislation inspired by the Blackstone case had strengthened whistleblower protections and increased penalties for corporate executives whose policies resulted in preventable deaths. The laws had made systematic fraud more difficult to conceal and much more expensive to pursue, fundamentally altering corporate risk calculations in industries that affected public health and safety. Emma's second book was nearing completion, a technical manual for healthcare workers who suspected their employers were engaging in systematic fraud. The book provided step-by-step guidance for documenting evidence, protecting whistleblower security, and coordinating with federal investigators who specialized in corporate medical crime. Jake's workshop had expanded to include training programs for young people who wanted to learn traditional woodworking and sustainable construction techniques. His students came from families throughout the region who were building alternative economic systems that could provide employment without dependence on corporate extraction industries. The solar panels that powered their cabin had been expanded to include battery storage that made them completely independent of the electrical grid, while their water system drew from mountain springs that provided pure drinking water without corporate filtration and distribution systems. Their lifestyle demonstrated that modern comfort could be achieved through sustainable technologies rather than corporate dependence. Emma's contractions began during a February snowstorm that painted the world in white silence, nature providing the peaceful setting for their second child's arrival. Jake called Dr. Mitchell using the satellite communication system that connected their cabin to the medical center, while Emma prepared for delivery with the calm confidence of someone whose first birth had been supported by skilled professionals rather than corporate profit optimization. The drive to Cedar Falls Medical Center took 40 minutes through snow that fell steadily, but wasn't heavy enough to make the roads impassable. Jake's truck had been equipped with chains and emergency supplies that made winter travel safe rather than desperate. Preparation that reflected security rather than survival anxiety. Dr. Mitchell was waiting when they arrived, her experienced hands and calm presence providing the medical expertise that made mountain childbirth safe for both mothers and babies. The medical center's delivery room had been designed by healthcare professionals rather than cost-cutting consultants. Its equipment maintained to the highest standards rather than deferred until failure threatened patient safety. Emma's labor progressed smoothly under Sarah's careful monitoring. Pain management provided through techniques that prioritized patient comfort rather than medication cost optimization. The delivery room's windows overlooked mountain wilderness that reminded everyone present of the natural beauty they were protecting through their resistance to corporate exploitation. Their son Daniel was born at dawn, his first breath drawn in a facility that embodied everything they had fought to create. The baby's name honored Jake's brother, while representing hope for a future where corporate violence against workers and patients would face systematic resistance rather than regulatory tolerance. Katie met her baby brother with the excited curiosity of someone whose secure childhood had prepared her for family changes that brought joy rather than stress. Her questions about baby care revealed understanding that families worked together to protect and nurture the vulnerable, lessons that would serve her well in a world where community cooperation was essential for resisting corporate exploitation. The cabin felt complete when they brought Daniel home. 4 people whose lives had been shaped by resistance to corporate oppression, but whose daily routines were defined by love and creative work rather than desperate survival. Jake's cradle provided perfect sleeping space for the baby whose future would unfold in communities that had learned to protect themselves from systematic corporate predation. Emma's recovery was supported by community members who brought meals and helped with childcare. Social networks that had been strengthened through shared struggle against corporate enemies who had sought to divide and isolate potential resistance. The mutual aid that surrounded their family reflected community values that prioritized human welfare over individual competition. Spring brought news that another healthcare corporation was under federal investigation for fraud patterns similar to those that had brought down Blackstone. Prosecutors using Emma and Jake's model of comprehensive evidence gathering to build cases that had previously been considered too difficult to prosecute. The legislation inspired by the Blackstone case had provided the legal framework for holding executives accountable for harm caused by corporate policies
that would be difficult to dismiss or delay. Corporate executives were discovering that systematic patient abuse now carried serious legal consequences rather than regulatory slaps on the wrist. The Community Resilience Conference drew participants from 12 states, environmental lawyers and healthcare advocates sharing strategies that had proven successful in their own regions. Emma's presentation on healthcare fraud documentation was attended by nurses and doctors who were gathering evidence against corporate employers whose policies endangered patient safety. Jake's workshop on corporate land theft provided practical guidance for communities fighting mining companies and development corporations that sought to seize property through fraudulent regulatory processes. His experience with successful resistance offered hope to groups that had previously felt powerless against corporate legal resources. Daniel's first months unfolded in a cabin surrounded by gardens that would provide food for his family and neighbors, his developing senses exposed to natural beauty rather than corporate advertising designed to create consumer desires. His childhood would be shaped by community values that prioritized human dignity over profit margins, environmental protection over resource extraction. Emma's third book focused on community healthcare systems that could serve rural populations without corporate dependence. Practical guidance for regions that wanted to develop medical facilities controlled by patients and healthcare professionals rather than distant shareholders. The book drew on their experience building Cedar Falls Medical Center into a model for community-controlled healthcare. Jake's expertise in sustainable construction had expanded to include renewable energy systems that made communities independent of corporate utility companies, his knowledge helping groups develop energy security that couldn't be manipulated for political or economic control.
Solar panels and battery storage had become standard features of community development projects throughout the region. Their evening conversations often returned to the miracle of transformation that had grown from their desperate alliance against corporate corruption. Two broken people who had discovered that love could multiply individual strength into collective power capable of achieving systematic justice. Their personal happiness had become inseparable from community welfare, individual success measured by contributions to collective resistance against corporate exploitation. The mountain wilderness that surrounded their home had been protected through federal legislation that prevented corporate resource extraction. Natural beauty preserved for future generations who would inherit communities capable of defending themselves against systematic predation. Crystal Lake reflected sunset colors that reminded them daily of intrinsic value that couldn't be reduced to commodity pricing. Daniel's first steps were taken in a workshop filled with tools that created, rather than destroyed. His developing motor skills guided by hands that had learned to build beauty from natural materials. His childhood would unfold in an environment where adult work served community needs rather than corporate profit margins, where human creativity was valued over consumer consumption. The ground beneath their feet had been transformed from frozen desperation into fertile soil that supported families and communities committed to justice rather than individual survival. Their love story had become part of a broader movement that challenged corporate impunity,
demonstrating that alternative economic systems could provide security and prosperity without exploitation. Emma's pregnancy with their third child was announced during the Community Harvest Festival, a celebration that marked another successful growing season, supported by sustainable agriculture rather than corporate farming systems that depleted soil and exploited migrant workers. The baby was due in spring, timing that would coincide with the 5th anniversary of their victory over Blackstone Corporation. Jake's latest project involved building a community center that would serve as headquarters for regional resistance networks. Architectural design that combined traditional construction techniques with modern sustainable technologies. The building would house legal clinics, educational programs, and meeting spaces that supported organized resistance to corporate exploitation attempts. Their story had become legend among communities fighting corporate oppression, proof that individual courage could trigger systematic institutional change when supported by collective action and sustained commitment to justice. Law schools taught case studies based on their investigation, while community organizers used their model of evidence gathering to challenge corporate criminals across multiple industries. The children growing up in Cedar Falls would inherit communities that had learned to protect themselves from systematic exploitation, social systems that prioritized human welfare over corporate profits. Their education would include practical training in community organizing, environmental protection, and sustainable economics that could resist corporate pressure while maintaining prosperity. Winter returned to the mountains with snow that covered their land in peaceful beauty. Natural cycles that provided rhythm for lives no longer driven by corporate deadlines or profit pressures. The fire that warmed their cabin illuminated faces marked by struggle, but softened by contentment that came from meaningful work and loving partnership. Emma and Jake sat together watching their children sleep, Katie dreaming of baby animals while Daniel smiled at invisible delights that filled his infant imagination. Their family represented hope for a future where love could triumph over systematic oppression, where communities could build prosperity without exploitation, where individual happiness contributed to collective welfare. The mountain man had found his woman in a blizzard of corporate corruption and personal devastation. Together they had built love that survived every test their enemies could devise, partnership that multiplied their individual strength into collective power that achieved justice for countless victims of systematic oppression. Their story would inspire future generations who faced similar choices between personal safety and moral courage, between isolated survival and collective resistance that could transform entire societies. The ground beneath their feet would continue growing beauty from the seeds they had planted through courage, love, and unwavering commitment to human dignity. Their legacy would outlast whatever storms the future might bring, something permanent and beautiful that proved individual love could become the foundation for communities capable of protecting everything worth defending.